The war between Israel and terror group Hamas is intensifying, which means the battle for information is becoming increasingly important. Now, for newsrooms around the world, it means grappling with how to attribute information correctly and avoid overcommitting to a narrative which cannot possibly be verified. And the New York Times is one such newsroom attempting to reconcile how on earth it ran this after Hamas alleged Israel had bombed a hospital, killing 500 people. It led to a lengthy and rare editor's note by the paper's executive editor, Joe Kahn, where he admitted failures by the paper and suggested it was an error to lead so prominently with the narrative that Israel was to blame for the deaths of hundreds of people.
So let me understand what you're saying, that a Hamas official told the Times that Israel was responsible, and we allowed that to be the dominant source early on, while, of course, attributing that account to Hamas.
We attributed it accurately to the Hamas health ministry official, but the information that official provided was not reliable enough for us to have formed a really big headline based on that information, yes.
If you have a terrorist organisation which is holding hundreds of hostages, you cannot rely solely on any information its leadership releases. That's what the New York Times did, though, and at least credit where it's due for admitting this mistake. The ABC, the BBC, and all of the usual offenders are just pretending that this egregious failure that we all took part in never happened. Now, you would think that this saga would become a cautionary tale for newsrooms around the world. But 1 week on from that failure, and news bulletins are still being led with unverifiable death toll figures, which entirely come from this terror group.
In Gaza, Hamas officials say at least 700 people have been killed in the last 24 hours. It means, according to those officials, that the total number killed in this war is now more than 5,700, including more than 2,300 children.
No doubt there have been civilian casualties, but the figures coming out from Hamas are completely unverifiable. And when you consider that the hospital bombing allegations make up 500 of that figure, you start to see how wildly inflated these figures could be. We now know that the hospital itself was not bombed, but instead it was a car park. And many military experts say the damage of the car park is more consistent with a death toll of 50 rather than 500. Now, it may seem obvious to many of you watching at home, but it has fooled trained professional journalists all over the world. And here is US President Joe Biden being asked to respond to the Hamas death toll.
In the 18 days since Hamas killed 1,400 Israelis, the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry says Israeli forces have killed over 6,000 Palestinians, including 2,700 children. You've previously asked Netanyahu to minimize civilian casualties. Do these numbers say to you that he is ignoring that message?
What they say to me is I have no notion that Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war. I think we should be incredibly careful. I think not we, the Israelis should be incredibly careful to be sure that they're focusing on going after the folks that are propagating this war against Israel. And it's against their interest when that doesn't happen. But I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using.
So did those journalists or pundits on the far left take on Biden's words? Have a listen to the Young Turks describe Biden as a genocide denier.
This is what we're going to talk about. This is why a lot of voters, specifically Arab and Muslim American voters, are turning on Joe Biden after coming out for him incredibly hard in 2020. But we're going to get into that. But what is your reaction to that response from the president?
I mean, it's genocide denial, and I expected him to downplay because he's not going to call it a genocide. He's not going to do that. But that's what it is. It's a genocide denial. And
these death toll figures are being used by human rights groups, politicians with vested interests, and radical left-wing activists to pressure Israel to pause. Now, if you want to talk about disinformation, this is it. Pushing unprovable death tolls and blaming nations without evidence for war crimes, all while hundreds of hostages remain trapped. It is a fact that many journalists seem to have lost sight of. And while I normally blame ignorance over malice in situations like this, I am struggling to understand how so many journalists could be so ignorant as to allow a terror group to write their headlines. Well, joining me this week on the panel is the Australian's media writer, Sophie Ellsworth, and PR Council Managing Director, Christy McSweeney. Sophie, thank you for joining us on the desk today. What do you make of this situation where you have, I thought Joe Biden did a very good job, just very sternly reminding people this is a terrorist organisation you're using to put these questions to me. How much legitimacy can we put on Hamas to assume that these figures are correct?
Well, that's right, Jack. The journalists need to point out whenever they're referring to Hamas that they are deemed a terrorist organisation around the world in many countries. So they need to point that out. And just running with whatever lines they have is very concerning. And I think in this whole, since we've seen this whole conflict unfold, the journalists really need to be careful, because at the moment, Jack, I think what happens is there's a headline, other journalists see it and then think, gee, we need to quickly follow before they try and verify any of this information. This is the new age of media, and especially in a situation like this where it is overseas, a lot of journalists are not on the ground. They're trying to quickly follow other media and be the first with the information, and I think that's fraught with danger.
Yeah, Christy, she makes a very good point, doesn't Sophie? For me, the cautionary tale should have been how we covered the hospital bombing and the failures that most of us in the media made in accepting that narrative, which we now know is disproven. But it doesn't seem like that lesson's been learned. It doesn't seem like it's sunk in.
No, it doesn't. And first of all, I'd like to pay credit to Joe Biden. I think he knows that this is his opportunity to demonstrate his experience in foreign policy and differentiate himself in the run-up to the next presidential election. He's done a wonderful job, and I hope some of his commentary and bravery rubs off on our own Prime Minister as he concludes his state visit in the US and comes home. Sophie is entirely correct. The diversification of the media environment being so immediate and in real time now means that media don't have time to verify and to check. But I will say there is absolutely no excuse. Doesn't matter how under pressure you are as a journalist, there is no excuse for giving credibility to a terrorist organisation. And we need to remember that President Biden has made the point that this is Israel's 9/11 moment. And if we look back the 20 years from 9/11, how the reporting of terrorism was done back then when the environment was perhaps less immediate, we can see that it was reported delicately yet objectively and on the right side of history. I don't think that's happening here.
Yeah, Sophie, let me pick up a point that Christy made as well. Joe Biden has made the right decision in this situation to point out that it's unreliable. We've got evidence that they've lied repeatedly. That alone should be enough for journalists to say this source isn't legitimate. In Australia, we have political leaders. We've got people from the Greens Party. We've got some from Labor left faction who are using these figures, who have used the hospital bombing figure to make a case that Israel should essentially stop trying to get the hostages out. That's egregious.
Well, Jack, really, they need to correct the record. If they're using information that turns out to be wrong, they need to correct the record. It's as simple as that. But there's a lot of political agendas going on here. We've seen that with politicians in our own country who, once they have a narrative, they stick with it, and anything that doesn't fit the narrative, they just shun away.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and Penny Wong obviously has asked for a pause. She's probably got intelligence which is a lot more concrete than we're seeing coming out. But it is the human rights groups, it is Hamas, which is one source, and they're taking that into consideration. Do you think it was a mistake for her to put out that media statement suggesting that we should pause, that the conflict should be paused, when there are hostages still hidden in tunnels?
Yeah. Well, Jack, I guess she has access to information that, like you say, where's the public probably don't, well, we don't know. So who knows what the real motive is behind that. But
I'd like her to be clearer in that case of ambiguity, just because
well, that's right, because we're questioning it, right? That's why we're talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it remains to be seen why she actually did that, but will have an impact or not? Probably not.
Yeah, very strange handling. Well, look, let's move on, because while we're on the topic of how the media has covered the conflict so far, it is important to point out specific instances of wrongdoing by some journalists. Now, we're lucky, obviously, to have Sophie Ellsworth with us here on the desk, because she has brought us information of the disgraced ABC journalist Tom Joyner, who used a group chat to try and convince hundreds of journalists reporting on the war that allegations of beheaded babies were, to use his words, not mine, BS. Now, Sophie's exclusive triggered widespread condemnation of Joyner and the ABC for failing to properly reprimand the reporter. The issue even followed ABC Managing Director David Anderson into Senate estimates, where he promised the Australian people that everyone was deeply apologetic and regretful.
Looking at a story that was quite awful to say out loud, that involved 40 babies, and we'd contacted the IDF about that, and they were unable to verify that had happened. His language was unfortunate. He knows that he's distressed people by using that language. As I said, he's quite remorseful that happened.
Now, that may be the case, but it appears to be that Joyner and the ABC are more regretful that they got caught. The journo hasn't been sacked, just rotated out of the region, and the ABC has continued to push pro-Hamas line over and over again. And this issue is not just an Australian one. I know we just gave the New York Times a bit of credit for owning up to a major mistake, but check out this story. The Times has just rehired a freelance journalist, Solomon Haya, even though he posted this image with the words, "How great you are, Hitler." When that's the maniac giving your newsroom on-the-ground intel, it's no wonder the Times got the hospital bombing story so wrong. And the extraordinary thing about this story is actually the statement the Times released to justify its decision to bring this evil maniac back into its fold. We reviewed the problematic social media posts by Mr. Haya when they first came to light in 2022 and took a variety of actions to ensure he understood our concerns and could adhere to our standards if he wished to do freelance work for us in the future. Mr. Haya followed those steps and has maintained high journalistic standards. He has delivered important and impartial work at great personal risk in Gaza during this conflict. Now, there are so many things wrong with that statement. Shouldn't praising Hitler be a zero-tolerance act? It is hard to see how he could be impartial about this conflict in any capacity. It is dangerous and appalling judgment by the Times. And remember this case the next time a progressive journalist talks about extremism. At the Times, extremism is welcome in its own newsroom. Now, Christy, I want to go to you first about this New York Times incident, because you've got here, it's an activist journalist, it's quite clear, but that's not the problem. The problem, we'll set that aside, that this journalist hasn't been impartial in the coverage quite clearly. This journalist, this freelancer, has posted in favour of Hitler, and the New York Times thinks that's appropriate to bring them back into the fold. What are your thoughts?
This is the worst public relations clean-up I think I've heard of ever. Absolutely ever. In any other workplace in the world, and I say the world deliberately, making a statement such as that would be instant dismissal. I note that the publication has gone on to try and justify their actions and talk about what a good reporter is and how he's put himself in the, on the line in dangerous situations. That conversation's not needed. The conversation needs to actually just stop with what he's done in that one sentence that he has put a voice to, and that should be the end of it.
Yeah, it should be a black and white case, right, Sophie? I'm really keen to get your thoughts quickly on this pro-Hitler New York Times situation, but also I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this Tom Joyner story and how it's progressed since you broke the news.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the Tom Joyner thing because I've been covering it right along, Jack. But David Anderson on Tuesday at Estimates basically condemned what he said in this WhatsApp group about the babies being beheaded story as BS, as you said. But the ABC seemed to find it really hard to take action when their journalists do something appalling. Now, let's just be clear to our viewers that Tom Joyner is under investigation. He has been rotated out of Israel and he will return to his base of Istanbul. Now, he is the Middle East correspondent for the ABC who said those disgraceful things with arrogance, I would say, to a group of 600-odd journalists from around the world. He is out of the Middle East when they're in the middle of a war. That is remarkable that their Middle East correspondent cannot be reporting on it at this time. I think they need to reassess where his job is at. That is a real worry that he's the representative, one of, for our national taxpayer-funded broadcaster, Jack.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And something else that we obviously haven't mentioned, but in relation to this, is the Heston Russell case, the defamation case. One of the judgments was that the ABC is too defensive. Do you think this is one of these cases where they get on the back foot, their immediate inclination is to defend the journalist rather than to look at it objectively and take action?
Well, Jack, I think because they have what appears to be an endless pot of cash, they can fight these things. So when they're in the wrong, they don't like to admit it, they can go to court. They can spend millions. They're not a commercial entity. So that's what they do, and I think they find it very hard to apologise or admit when they make mistakes.
Yeah, if it was a commercial outlet, they'd be sacked. But you're right, there's a protection racket for them.